we're going forward, they're popping up on my screen. This is a topic today of high interest. My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Chamber, and we're very honored and pleased to have the world's foremost expert on USMCA and NAFTA and that transition that's happening. And that's really important because exporters in particular are in the mega region and beyond are impacted by the changes in USMCA. So Dan Ujczo of Dickinson Wright is going to be speaking in more depth today about the American situation and the USMCA. A couple weeks ago, you'll see a blog post. He spoke more generally about trade agreements and what's happening. I'm sure we'll be talking about that as well today. But today we're going to be really focused in on USMCA and Dan's expert thoughts about what you should be doing as an exporter and give you a little bit more context. So Dan, thank you so much for all the great information you share with our members, all the great work that you do. Based out of Columbus, Ohio, the firm Dickinson Wright is headquartered in Detroit, but they're all across the US and they're very global. They have international practices for India, China, Japan, Canada, and Dan is the practice leader on the international side. So again, thank you, Dan, and why don't you please kick us off?
Well, great. Well, thank you, Doug, as always, for the generous introduction. And first and foremost, before we press forward here, is I do want to, just on behalf of Dickinson Wright, and certainly extend my personal sentiments to all of you for the best wishes for your health and safety and as needed recovery as we deal with this global pandemic. I know that Doug is quite fond, and the Global Chamber is always talks about the global tribes, the global village, these nodes and networks that bring us all together and contribute to our security, prosperity, our culture as we come ever closer together. But there are the downsides to that, and we're living through that as we speak, and wish you all nothing but the best. And personally, my thoughts and prayers as there's a number of you who are longstanding friends and new on the line. I have to confess, I was on the fence as to whether to proceed today, late last week. For two reasons. One, mindful of the health issues. We're all afraid in some ways and various levels. A lot of us, we were just talking about just changes to life. If our iPhone breaks or an appliance breaks or picking up a pizza, those kind of things. I have an 8-year-old who you may see running around here in a second, depending on how he's doing here at home. But there are those very real issues that we're all confronting. Additionally, on the business side, and Doug mentioned this a moment ago, that we're all confronting this from a business perspective. Dickinson Wright has offices throughout the United States and Canada. Our practices are in all the locations Doug mentioned, with China, India, Japan, Europe, et cetera, and we have clients all over the world. And we've been dealing with the pandemic. We've actually had an internal task force on this since late fall, winter. And we're mindful of what our clients are struggling with. You know, when we're just struggling to keep the lights on or to get that part from overseas, the question is, how much bandwidth is there really to deal with a future trade agreement? And reflection on that over the last week or so, one of the things that really hit home is that there's going to be a time where things start to resume. As we get into business resumption, as we get into recovery, and the questions there are, what are we going to do next? And in thinking about this, there's likely no better path to recovery than what we're dealing with in USMCA. I think Canada, Mexico, and the United States actually deserve a great deal of credit for getting this done, so that when we start to go back to the new normal, that having that stability and security in North America. And so, you know, in that mindset, this is actually something in an extraordinary time in which we're in. But looking ahead, this is actually very important as we look for growth and recovery as in just a few weeks, hopefully, maybe months, depending on how things go. And I'm also just mindful, you know, I think the Global Chamber has been somewhat inspiring over the past week or so in saying we're pressing ahead. And just once again, I've done several of these USMCA presentations during the last 3 years with the Global Chamber, and it seems like every time we have one scheduled, and keep in mind that they're scheduled months in advance, that something big happens just right before. And I think Doug should be picking our stocks or the lottery or numbers or something, but of course, as many of you saw, Canada just passed its implementing legislation last week. So here we are at another watershed moment. So the timing is extraordinary. At the same time, I think I've come out on the side that this is a positive time to be here, both as we move to February to March. Now, just looking to advance to the next slide, I seem to be having some trouble advancing the slides here, guys. There we go. So as I mentioned, Dickinson Wright's around the world, and certainly throughout the continent, and that gives you an idea of our geographic footprint in the Great Lakes, U.S. Southeast and U.S. Southwest. And then I just want to make sure, next slide, please, if somebody can run that for me, and move ahead. So the question is, as we look at USMCA, TMEC, and CUSMA, as it's known in the three countries, we are in the march to manage trade, and I've shared this before, both in our event at the Global Chamber just a short period of time ago, and throughout our discussion. But as we go through today, it's very important that we recognize that USMCA is just one piece of this. It's a very important piece here in North America, but it's also tied to this new reality that we're living in trade, even prior to the pandemic. USMCA, we did see Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. And while those tariffs exist in many parts of the world still, that the U.S. has imposed, but in USMCA, we replaced those, or I'm sorry, in North America, we replaced those tariffs with a monitoring system, and USMCA also requires now that 70% of all steel and aluminum that are used in the auto sector come from North America. And the auto companies, many of which we represent, are going to have to certify that. And during the next product run, it usually takes about 6 or 7 years to design a new car. By the time that happens, that steel will actually have to be melted and poured in North America, which means we can't import slab from around the world and refine it in Mexico, Canada, the United States, and those processes, much of which we do here in my home state of Ohio, that we're actually going to have to melt and pour that steel. So that's another piece of how we're seeing managed trade. Now, I've amplified this many times in recent weeks and months that the China tariffs are in play here in North America, because what was the solution, a year and a half, 2 years ago that many of us deployed on China tariffs was, well, let's end around the United States. We'll bring that product into Mexico or Canada or to other third countries, and then, particularly with Mexico, refine that, engage in some type of substantial transformation, call it a product of Mexico, and then it becomes part of the North American supply chain. Well, what's happening is, in dealing with Section 301 China tariffs, U.S. Customs and Border Protection has issued a series of rulings over recent months that change, in many ways, the old rules on substantial transformation and NAFTA. So things that used to be NAFTA, if you look at USMCA, would say, yeah, it still counts, but it has to be viewed in conjunction with these rulings on China tariffs. So it may not be what it seems. Of course, in North America, we're no longer that concerned about national security tariffs on autos, but what happens as our components are sourced from around the world and as those threats remain out there, particularly with Europe. And then on the good news side is, of course, we're seeing new deals with Korea, Japan. Obviously, I think things with Europe and the UK are parked, and that could be good. That could be, while it's a delay, it actually could be a good thing, because where there was a great deal of uncertainty going into 2020 was with Europe, and I don't think we're going to see the administration do anything to really rattle the economy any much more than what we see right now. And then, of course, issues with India and Africa. Next slide, please. But I think it's very important, and just to amplify the point, that what we're seeing with anti-dumping rulings, safeguards, and these U.S. customs rulings are just as important as these concerns over what's in the agreement itself. So next slide. So what does this all mean for companies that are confronting this? Now, these are all the timelines. We've seen this many times, many ways. The only thing I want to emphasize is we're at the end, which is good. This is the U.S. procedural. We've talked so many times over the years about these deadlines, and we've been like high school kids in the negotiations and getting things done. We've waited to the last minute every single time. Next slide, please. But that begs the question for all of us now as businesses, when? Now, mindful that things are, when is now, in light of everything else. Now, if you could just kind of keep clicking through this slide, this gives you a piece of the history here. But let's stop here. What you may have seen, so what happened last Friday, is that Canada passed its implementing legislation. Kind of layman's terms, ratified. It's actually technically not ratification in Canada's system. But the 3 countries are done. And the way that it works is on the first day of the 3rd month that comes into play. Very biblical sounding. Some say 90 days, some say 60. It's actually 60. So what this means is what should happen right now is what's called certification. The 3 countries all have obligations that they have to undertake domestically. Mexico with labor and some customs issues. Canada with intellectual property. All 3 countries have to make some changes. And what they're supposed to do is notify the others that, hey, we're done. And when that exchange of letters happen, that starts the clock to get to the first day of the 3rd month. Well, what we're hearing now is that the U.S. administration is telling folks on the Hill that June 1, that since Canada's done, April starts the clock, by June 1 we should be ready to go. Mexico previously had been saying July 1. Our view is that they're likely going to fudge, wink, wink, smile, smile, the certification process to have the clock started. So I don't think anything's going to hold back the certification, including this pandemic. What's more important is between now and the day USMCA comes into force are that the uniform regulations are supposed to be in play, or are supposed to be completed. So beyond that certification process, what else is happening is that the 3 countries, their agencies, should be meeting to design rules for how we're actually going to use this agreement. And so for many of us, we don't use the treaty on a day-by-day basis. We use, for example, the Code of Federal Regulations in the U.S., or the rulings that Canada Border Services Agency or U.S. Customs or Mexican Customs put out, what our agriculture agencies, FDA, USDA. And what the 3 countries have to do is design all of that between now and the implementation date or the in-force date. What we think is going to happen is, and that process takes time, and in fact what we had started hearing a lot of rumblings where they would not be ready with the uniform regs by July 1, and certainly not June 1. We were saying sometime between Independence Day, our 4th of July picnics, and Labor Day picnics in the U.S., Canada Day, Labor Day in Canada, that we would see something this summer, that it would come into force. There had been some outliers out there that saying this likely wouldn't come into force until January 1 of 2021. What I think we're likely to see are some announcements that USMCA is being implemented sometime. Maybe it's June, maybe it's July. But the actual enforcement of USMCA may not come until later this fall and year. So there may be a period of informed compliance because there's a lot of pushback on the Hill, particularly in light of COVID-19, that how are we possibly going to get these uniform regs done? But I want to emphasize this point to companies. This is a reality right now. USMCA will be in play sometime this summer at the earliest, or maybe as late as January 1. But now's the time to get in action. And so as you can see in the next few slides, and if you can kind of click through these slides, here's just some history just for your own records as to when Mexico implemented, the U.S. implemented. Of course, now we have Canada, so we've added all of the dates with Canada. But coming to the slide that what's really important for U.S. companies is, and those that advise companies, is why should we be concerned? So we know the when. The when is sometime this summer, maybe as late as the new year, but it's now. But why? Well, here's three reasons. Number one, that uniform regulation process is moving very quickly. As you can see, they're going to have to get it done. And this is really the last chance if there's something unclear to you in USMCA, that folks like myself or other service providers can go in and talk to our government officials and say, look, I think this language in the treaty and or in the agreement and how you're interpreting this doesn't make sense. Or there's a gray area, or you've included these folks but not our folks. Here's a chance for you to really make some changes to make sure that this provides benefits to you. And that process is going to happen quickly. So that's at the top end. At the second end, and so the only way to do that, of course, is to understand how it impacts you. The second reason is we have done calls up until we've been dealing with the fires of the day on COVID-19. I've spent most of my life over the last 6 to 8 months dealing with China tariffs and spending hours at a time on the line, 8, a dozen and a half companies a day, walking through USMCA and talking about how it may impact your operations. And what we have found is that there are significant benefits for companies. And some of it may just be very minor changes between NAFTA and USMCA. I was on a call recently with a polymer and chemical distributor, so folks that distribute chemicals, coatings, paints, etc. And after we talked, they called back about a week and a half later and said, we think these minor changes in the agreement are going to save us about $17 million. And that's just pure profit. That's minor changes in the agreement, just changing how we do some rules of origin. And there are benefits throughout this agreement. So as we are all very nervous right now on what the economy is going to look like, one of the things to do is look at this agreement as a potential way to find that profitability in the second, third, and fourth quarters of this year. And last but not least is, let me be blunt, all companies are going to have to deal with this. If you're using NAFTA now, you are going to either have to tweak your forms because all of a lot of the chapters are not the same in USMCA and NAFTA. The numbers are different. So you're going to have to clean up your forms. So there's going to be minor tweaks like that. In our experience of talking to companies, there is going to be some transitioning that needs to be done. And in some cases, there's going to have to be transformation in what you're doing. So there are a number of compelling reasons to get ahead of this. And again, starting, just mindful of where we started, we are very mindful of the time in which we're living now. But this is happening, and companies need to get out front. Next slide, please. So how do you do that? And many of you have heard me say the model that we've been using, and I caution those of you that may just be tuning in for the first time on USMCA, you've heard that we have ripped up NAFTA. Well, that's not true. 60%, it's actually about 57%, from some really brilliant folks up in Canada, ran some algorithms and found that 57%, so 60%, of the agreement is largely the same as NAFTA or includes very similar language or trade agreements since NAFTA. So some of the TPP found its way in there. So one way to think of that is we've kept what's worked. Contrary to the narrative that we were red in tooth and claw and just ripping things up, we actually kept the good. On the flip side, we didn't just rebrand NAFTA, and I think that's the commentary that has me the most concerned for our companies, is companies, particularly in the times in which we live, are going to hear rebrand. Well, I can worry about that later. Well, 40% of one of the world's largest trading regions is different. And people will say, well, it's just autos. Well, automotive is all advanced manufacturing. It's a framework. It's a backbone of North America and the global economy. These are major changes that are coming in. And if you don't believe me, the fact is that we were thinking we were going to need 35 to 45 Democrat votes in the U.S. House of Representatives. We ended up getting close to 200. So if Democrats are voting for a trade deal, many of whom voted no on the original NAFTA, something is different here. So this is a renovation of the USMCA. And what it is in a renovation is we put on a fresh coat of paint on that 57–60%. We've upgraded the fixtures and appliances. So we've put in some really new state-of-the-art agreements. And that's where the benefits are to our companies. And then there's been some rebalancing where we've knocked down walls. And anybody that's done a home renovation knows that you start knocking down walls, it's more disruptive, it takes longer and costs more than you would ever imagine. And that's where we're going to see that transformation. So the Trumpian bargain, the Lighthizer bargain, was business is going to get a lot of the things that they wanted in exchange for some of the things that the U.S. wanted in terms of knocking down those walls. Next slide, please. So when we look at those templates very quickly, and mindful of the time here, that we will see in the agreement that there's a chapters on small and medium-sized enterprises. There's a competition chapter. When you look here, a lot of these things are not immediate benefits, but these are more mid to long-term range. So good regulatory practices, meaning take the work that Canada and the U.S. and Mexico have done on things like the Regulatory Cooperation Council, where we're looking at how do we approve products for licensing standards. You get a product approved in one country, maybe it's approved in the other. We're not doing that, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but we've put the mechanism in place in this agreement. I know our Canadian friends are very excited about the competition chapter. And the goal here was that we don't have to wait 25 years to update this agreement. There's anywhere between 24 to almost 30 working groups in this agreement that will be staffed by business and government officials that will constantly keep USMCA evergreen. That should be good news. And the anti-corruption chapter, I have to say, is best in class. And it was actually a Mexican proposal. So that should be somewhat in good news for many companies. Now, next slide. On a more tangible level, what we see is if you start working through, there's a lot of good news in there for chemical polymers, for those in the food processing industry, for our agriculture companies, for financial service companies. There's been some things that just got really kind of rough around the edges over the last 25, 30 years. And this is where walking through the agreement with folks like ourselves or others and just saying, here's how we use NAFTA today. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But and we know where the changes are, and we can see maybe this will provide you that millions of dollars in benefits that we see. Now, next slide. Now, where the more changes that are more headline-grabbing changes is we put in a digital chapter, a technology chapter. We've added changes for everybody that uses NAFTA and customs and trade facilitation, which is just a fancy way of saying the border. How are we moving goods across the border? And lastly, an energy chapter. I'm going to talk more about customs and trade facilitation in just a few minutes, but I want to focus on the digital chapter because we haven't talked a lot about that at the Global Chamber. So just looking at the digital trade, this isn't just for tech companies. You know, all of our economy is moving towards digital. So on the next slide, please, what you can see are some of the changes is we've guaranteed, now this has already been a de facto rule in trade, but we haven't quite got there at the WTO. But what we've done in North America said we're not going to put duties or customs or tariffs on digital data flows. That should be good news. We will not allow our countries that require data localization, particularly for financial services, meaning you don't have to put your server in a place where you're doing business. And we're seeing that around the world, in India and other places, that we're not going to do that in North America. There are some exceptions on health and safety issues, security issues, but those are consistent with recognized norms around the world. Now, some of the issues that will impact companies are there's going to be greater protection for patents, particularly in Canada. Some rules that some of the issues are when patent offices are delaying, we've actually given protection to the patent holder or the proposed registrant, so that just because the time is taking longer, that we're actually, so a lot of this intellectual property is much more of a U.S. focused as opposed to open source, which is we're protecting the innovators. Copyright has been extended to 70 years, which after the life of the copyright holder, that's the Mickey Mouse rule. Every time Mickey Mouse gets a little bit older, U.S. copyright law gets older because Disney wants to protect. So the three countries have agreed to do that. And we've also put some protections in there for producers and performers. Next slide, please. So all of this means that for U.S. companies, even if you're in the tech space, a lot of good news. But even if you're not, your intellectual property portfolio may need some tweaking up. Now, we've also done some things on geographic indicators. There's no internet service protection. There is internet service protection for third parties. So your internet service providers have liability protection. So things when people are commenting or putting things, that protects our internet service providers. We're protecting source code. But one of the other issues that may be important for companies too is a long-standing issue between Canada and the United States is that if you find intellectual property violations, that you can actually require the customs officials in the USMCA countries to actually enforce. So as our supply chains become more integrated, we've had issues in the past for example, we know a container's coming into Canada or Mexico full of counterfeit appliances or technology. This makes it so we don't have to wait for it to get to the United States and potentially into those distribution centers, that we can actually ask CBSA or Mexican customs or in that matter U.S. customs if it's coming into Long Beach or New York or elsewhere, Savannah, that they can actually enforce that. And so procedures will be developed over time. So all of this to say, as we move to the next slide, that North America is the safest hub for digital technology issues. Now, we are going to see some issues. Privacy issues are always front and center. We are dealing as a global economy on the digital services tax that Europe, the UK is actually supposed to, the UK actually passed it. It won't come into force for a while, but dealing with some of these issues. And what do we do? Keep in mind, USMCA, at least in the United States, only binds the national government. So what do we do if states start getting a little rowdy on this stuff? And so those are interesting legal questions, but in the near term, the safest place in the world in which to conduct digital trade and intellectual property protection is North America because of USMCA. Now, moving somewhat on the quick step, now as we move into new issues, I should note too, I think one of the transformative things that we will see is a lot of technology is moving into, and call centers and other types of things are being nearshored into Mexico. So I think we're going to see a lot of nearshoring from India and elsewhere, largely because they're in the same time zone as Silicon Valley for the most part. And so these protections, we're going to see a lot of call centers. They're already in Guadalajara and places like Cali, Colombia, and Nicaragua, but I think we're going to see a lot of that in North America now, coming back to North America from overseas. Next slide, please, because of these safe harbors that we have. Now, when we're knocking down walls, and these are where the major changes are coming, the U.S. had three priorities. One, as I've stated at the outset, was to close the back door to China through Mexico and Canada. And I'll talk in a moment about how that happened. So what happened over time, right, this wasn't just make a product in Mexico, make a product in Canada, and ship it into the United States, or any way that those three countries would work. What we've seen is with globalization, particularly with China's entry into the WTO, is a lot of goods are coming from China or from other third countries into Mexico, Canada, and the United States, and then once they're in the North American supply chain, moving freely throughout. And what's happened over time is less and less North American content. Actually, we're USMCA required for the most part 60% or higher North American goods, and in most, or at least the majority in some cases, depending on which formula you use. A lot of studies show that it's roughly around 40 to 44% North American-made content. So less and less content, and the U.S. wanted to do a 180 on that. Secondly, we're going to rebalance trade with Mexico through things like addressing labor issues and the like, and then what I call the Michael Corleone priority, no offense. The Godfather just celebrated yet another anniversary since its first release in the early 1970s, but we're going to settle all the family's business. While we got the three countries at the table, there are some things. I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but while we were there, things like, can you watch Super Bowl commercials in Canada instead of having to watch Canadian? Wine sales in Canada, dairy issues with Canada. These are all major issues for those sectors, but they had been kind of big issues between the U.S. and Canada, U.S. and Mexico, trucking issues with Mexico for quite some time. And the goal was to resolve those there while we were all at the table. But for most importantly, I think where most of us are going to see this impact is closing us on priorities 1 and 2. If I can ask for the next slide, please. And so what we see is that some of the ways really happen in automotive rules of origin. So I talked about requiring more steel to be made in North America, not coming from overseas. And that includes a lot of the tool and die equipment. Dispute resolution, a sunset clause. We are going to review the USMCA every 6 years. And so a lot of work will be done between now and then to make sure that this is working. And then if there's things that need change, we have 10 years. We've eliminated the government procurement chapters, so things like Buy America and some preferences in there. And there are provisions in USMCA on non-market economies. So if any of the three countries go out and deal with, for example, China or other non-market economies, that they have to tell the other two have to be kept apprised, and the other two can throw the other party out. Interesting to see if USMCA is enforced by the time, if we ever do a phase 2 China deal, how that will actually work. So we'll see that there. Next slide, please. So rebalancing trade with Mexico, a lot of this had to do with the auto rules of origin. So what we've seen in auto rules, and we are doing a number of separate consultations on this, and perhaps can do that with the Global Chamber, is in the past, your North American-made automobile and parts needed to be somewhere between 60 to 62.5% made in North America. That is now a regional value content of 75%. So where in practice it may have been in the mid-40s, now we've gone to 75%. Included, so every automaker now has to classify their parts and determine, is it 75%? There are separate categories for 70 and 65. And also everybody has to figure out at the plant level, what is the value of the labor, because 40% of that labor needs to be made at $16 an hour or higher. And what that doesn't mean is that we're raising the minimum wage in Mexico. What we're doing is saying 40% of a vehicle needs to be made where the labor rate is $16 an hour or higher, meaning Canada and Mexico. So what that means are those last suppliers in the U.S. that were gradually moving south into the U.S. Southeast and ultimately into Mexico, that will stop, arguably, because what that means is purchasing and procurement officers will, at the auto companies, will be saying, I need to have suppliers in Ohio, Michigan, Ontario, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Arizona, et cetera, for manufacturing. We've also done some things on investment. I'm going to talk more about labor in just a moment. So so those issues are how we're rebalancing trade with Mexico. And just on the next slide, I've talked about some of the Michael Corleone issues. So we didn't deal with seasonality, this idea that after NAFTA came into force, that produce from Mexico was coming into the United States. Great boon to our restaurant industry, fruit processors in California and Arizona, hurt Florida tomato growers and others, and Georgia and the U.S. Southeast. That was a very potentially large issue here. We're dealing with that outside of USMCA. Biologic protection, protecting biologics in the pharmaceutical industry, where the pharma industry had put a lot of weight behind this and wanted protections, market exclusivity for a period of time. This was a huge issue in the TPP. We actually dropped that to get Democrat votes. Very interesting issue there. Dairy in Canada, wheat grading in Canada. I raise this because if you're in any of these sectors, there are some very specific changes for you, including when we dropped protection on pharmacologics or on biologics. We actually put some stronger IP standards in there. So in the pharmaceutical industry, there are some major changes in USMCA. Now, let's drill down in the final few minutes that we have before your questions and talk about what does this all mean as we move into the next slides for U.S. companies. What are some of the tricks of the trade that we have? And you can see some other issues here. I mentioned some of these as well. Moving into, so we talked about when this will come in force, why you need to care, how do you do this? Well, number one, as I said at the outset, as in the next slide, is the first thing is your certificates of origin. This should be your number one priority because if you're using NAFTA now, you have certificates of origin. Either your purchasing team, your in-house customs teams, recognizing many companies don't have that, but your customs brokers. In the NAFTA, kind of the brilliance of the NAFTA originally was that every producer, so I take parts from all over the world. I have my operations in Mexico. I put those all together. I look at the NAFTA rules and I say this meets those NAFTA rules of origin. I then produce a form certificate of origin, and everybody uses the same form primarily. And then I give that to you as my customer in Canada and the United States, or the United States. And then if you're then putting that component into yours, you run the certificates of origin, and we really have this piling on of certificates of origin. What's happened over time is that we as the North American trade community have become so reliant on certificates of origin. That we're not sure that all of the things that we've said that we may have been doing for 10, 15, 25 years are actually still products of Mexico. Because we may have started importing from other parts of the Americas. Yeah, that was once a Mexican, maybe it's there. We started importing from China, et cetera. And we're doing this throughout North America. Additionally, a lot of times as we work through the supply chain, and we talk to companies and say, let me see your certificate of origin, they'll say, well, yeah, our supplier, I'll get it from my supplier. And people just fill these out, and they're wrong on their face. Because in some cases, you'll see boxes checked or preference criteria for a motor or a brake pad or a refrigerator or a computer server or anything that it's checking the preference criteria for stuff that can only come out of the ground, like a turnip, right? And so, or a tomato. And so some of these things, people are like, yeah, we're filling them out. So that's how we went from 60% to 40% in practice. So what the USMCA does is the USMCA has eliminated certificates of origin, and that was meant to be a red type. So all companies have to do now is they still have to certify origin, but there's no prescribed form. And everybody said, oh, thank God, because every time I make a change, I don't have to change my form. But on the next slide, please, what that means for all of you is you really can't rely on these. So this over-reliance we have, there's no such thing as a certificate of origin anymore. And this is all happening at the very time that, as I said at the outset, U.S. Customs is redefining what it means to be a product that's undergoing substantial transformation, which is the buzzword, right? For meaning I take products from all around the world into Mexico, Canada, the U.S., and now I'm doing something here and I'm calling that a product of the U.S. or Mexico, Canada. Well, those rules are all changing as we speak. Additionally, U.S. CBP has issued some new decisions on what's called Chapter 98. When we send things, for example, from the U.S. to maybe go get dipped in Mexico in a zinc coating or to go grind wheels, those rules are all changing, potentially. So what we used to think was fine under a certificate of origin and substantial transformation under NAFTA, and it may look like it's good under USMCA, it's probably not in some cases. So what every company has to do is go back and get that pile of certificates of origin and start working your way back, and don't trust your existing certificates of origin. You have to go back and re-verify, apply the rules in USMCA. In a lot of instances, you'll be fine. But in some instances, this is a really good time to know when enforcement comes into play. Next slide, please. So beyond certificates of origin, I've talked a lot about the auto rules of origin. A lot of the auto rules of origin are going to depend on what comes out of the uniform regulations. We in the auto industry and many others are working with our three governments to do this, but if you are in the auto industry, there are major changes coming. And you need to get in front of USMCA if you're not there already. Now, keep in mind when I say auto industry, so many people say, well, there are very few companies in manufacturing that don't touch the auto industry somehow. So what's going to happen is the big original equipment manufacturers, the tier 1 suppliers and others are going to start sending out surveys, if they haven't already, throughout their entire supply chain. So you may be making wire harnesses, antenna, GPS, things that are used in all types of industries. You're going to get a request that says, we want to see what your rules of origin, what is your sourcing for those components that you're using, what's your labor value content, et cetera. And if you can't fill that out, you may start losing customers. So this is really important if you're in any parts of the manufacturing industry, particularly in tech. Because tech doesn't always think of itself as auto. These rules are going to impact you as well. Because it's not just what's in the agreement and what government officials are doing, it's what we as industry are doing to prepare for this. And and we're all dealing with the issues of coronavirus now and business resumption and sourcing and supplying and our supply chain disruption and force majeure and all of the things that we're dealing with every day. But eventually you're going to start seeing surveys come from suppliers saying, we want to see all this information from you. And this started to really heat up in the last quarter of 2019, and I expect it to heat back up once we get past and back into business resumption recovery mode. Next slide, please. As we look at, I've talked about labor reform in Mexico. There are minimum wage increases. They're not $16. This is actually the result of Mexico's minimum wage domestic increases. So for those of you doing that, there's also domestic labor reform in Mexico that's required by USMCA. And there will be a lot of, there are a number of interagency panels and monitoring holding Mexico's feet to the fire to implement this labor reform. So I say that not in a paternalistic way. I say that in a way that I meet with a lot of companies that say, yeah, we've heard this before in Mexico, that labor reforms were coming or changes are coming. This is real. Next slide, please. This is the largest labor reform in North America since the New Deal. So the next several years will be spent addressing our supply chain issues and new procurement issues with a new labor framework in Mexico. And just to give you an idea, one of the things that was put in was a rapid response labor mechanism that we could have a whole separate webinar on. But what this is that there will be folks on the ground unionizing facilities in Mexico. And these are not the unions that are presently there that arguably are more closely aligned with companies than what we see in Canada and in the United States. That there is going to be a new set of unionization happening, collective bargaining, and in order to protect those rights, you can see on the slides here is that if it's seen as that there's interference in that collective bargaining process, that we will see that there's now a facility-specific rapid response labor mechanism, and companies that interfere with that can have their goods stopped at borders if there's a violation found. If there's 2 violations found over a period of time, they lose NAFTA, or excuse me, first they lose duty-free treatment. Next slide, please. If there's 2 violations, that plant can actually stop the goods at the border and no longer be used. And if there's a third offense, companies that have multiple operations, you can actually have your product stopped for all of your facilities. And so this has a lot of teeth in it and should be very important for companies. Now, as we wind down in the final minutes here, let me just say what are some very practical things that you all can do, moving to the next slide. On this, let me just say on labor, first thing is if you have operations in Mexico, you should be conducting HR labor management compliance audits. Take a look at what is going on down there. And if you're not doing it already, we are doing these in conjunction with a number of our Mexican counterparts and some great partnerships that we have, just to see where you are in this process and what that potential impact could be. This is not just pie in the sky talk. This is reality, and we're going to see more and more of this on the ground. So continue to move forward on the slides. So what are some strategies? First, what we are talking, and we have a whole kit prepared for our clients and our clients' clients and customers, where we have been meeting. First things first, assemble your documents from your purchasing, procurement, your customs brokers, your financial team, accounting, and just say, hey everybody, how are we using NAFTA? How are we using NAFTA? There's a bit of a typo there. It should be, how are we currently using NAFTA? And start with those certificates of origin. Then pull all of the purchase orders and your standard T's and C's that you're using for your North American trade. Pull your IP portfolio. It's a good time to take a look at your copyrights, your trademarks, your patents. Then pull all of your transportation contracts with your 3PL providers, your transportation providers, your customs brokers, your freight brokerage. And I know so many of our companies don't have their own contracts. What do? You just agree to the addendum that your 3PL provider gives you, your logistics provider, your motor carrier. They usually just stand you standard terms and conditions. Well, right now is a really good time to take a look at that and get those upgrades. What we encourage all of our clients to do is engage in an independent customs self-assessment. If you do not have a customs compliance manual, if you do not have an organizational chart that says who's responsible for customs in your company, saying we just let the customs brokers do that, that's not enough. Because one thing Republicans and Democrats agree on in the U.S. is giving more money for enforcement. We are going to see customs audits go up, particularly to look at USMCA, particularly to look at China. And if you don't have the basic procedures in place, you're going to get a letter from customs that says, we're looking at these shipments and here's a list of documents that we want. If you don't have those just off the shelf, those are black marks against you. So now's a really good time to start looking at those things. And those are things, all of these things are very easy to do. And I think all of us need to get into know my suppliers' suppliers. What I mean by that is for so long, I guarantee you, and again, doing this for month after month, talking to companies about USMCA compliance, is every single company will say, well, yeah, we get that out of Mexico, we get that out of Canada, or if you're in Canada, we get that out of Mexico, US, and I don't mean to just sound US-centric here. But yeah, we get a certificate of origin for that. Well, let me see the certificate of origin. Well, who are the suppliers for this product? You're telling me what the product is, and yes, it complies with Mexico, with NAFTA, but do you actually know what's in that product? And the answer invariably is no. No, we rely on our purchaser. We rely on the producer to give that to us. Well, under the USMCA, and this was actually true under NAFTA, which it's just eroded this responsibility over time, is you have to know everything that's in your supply chain. And now is a really good time to do that, because if you go through this, and this process takes a couple of hours to really walk through this, is A, let me work in reverse order from where I started. You're going to have to do this anyway. B, you're going to find benefits and be ready to go. And C, there's a chance to change some things through the uniform regs if we need to. So that's where I'll end the next couple of slides. But I think that's it. I really think for those of you that may have stopped paying attention, but let me just emphasize, if you know you have product from China or other third countries coming into your North American supply chain, you really need to hunker down on this. It's kind of funny. I'm wearing the exact same shirt and tie that's in that picture from a few years ago, which shows you how stylish I am, but I'm not as skinny as the guy in that picture. So I'll end on that note and take any of the questions that you may have. Thanks, Doug.
That's a good question. So you touched on this before, and you touched on this again today about the amounts of materials that maybe historically, maybe today, come in from China, go through Mexico, and to be okay, but no longer is okay. Is that what you're saying? Is that part of the loophole that's been caught here is that anybody that's getting a product out of Mexico in particular is going to have to do a little bit of a deep dive on the certificate of origin to be able to avoid problems in the future?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I think, and it's not in the text of USMCA, right? When we go through USMCA, there's going to be a lot of folks and brokers that look at this and say everything's fine, right? But then the question is going to be from an enforcement perspective. Is the rules around this are changing in U.S. customs rulings on a very fact-specific basis. And there are a number of things that I've looked at where I've said this is no longer going to work under NAFTA USMCA. And it's not always because of the USMCA text. It's because the definition, what we used to say was substantial transformation under just general rules or NAFTA, customs is changing that right now. So I think I would say the overwhelming majority of the time, you're going to be fine, right? I don't want to sound completely paranoid here. But you need to look at it for your own compliance perspectives and to be able to have the paperwork to support that so that shipments aren't stuck. And then you go through the process of having to make prior disclosures or potentially protesting, which is a costly process. So because customs is going to say no, potentially, then you're going to have to liquidate and then you're going to have to do a protest, right, and say, or you're going to keep bringing it in, customs not going to catch you until way down the road, and then you're going to have to make prior disclosures. And that gets to be a very costly process. So the time to do that is actually right now. And make sure you're clean. In the majority of the cases, you will be fine. But there's going to be cases out there, and I can tell you because we find them, that you're not. And then we can come up with other solutions. There's other ways to do it, but and to be compliant. But, just winging it isn't an option right now.
Fantastic. We have about 10 or we'll have to shut it down. So keep your questions coming. And if you can also send them to info@globalchamber.org. And if you don't get to it, we'll find a way to get to that. And if you need to speak with Dan and you're a member, we're happy to connect you as well. One of the attendees today is Mara of Warren News, and she has a question. Dan, do you expect uniform regulations will be circulated to industry in April? If not, will June 1st happen? How set is the administration on sticking to June 1st despite the Hill pushback?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think number one, I think it was a long shot to get the uniform regulations done by June 1st. Certainly not in autos. Whether they could be circulated in August, my understanding is that there are some drafts out there, but they frankly haven't been touched in recent weeks. But there's always the opportunity to get this done. I mean, one of the lessons of USMCA is when people put their minds to it on a deadline, they can actually get some things done. But the inability to travel, the priority focus on other areas, I think it's going to be a long shot that we get these uniform regs done, and a chance that they could be circulated in April. I think, again, that was a long shot before. I think coronavirus makes it highly unlikely. But how the countries address that, like I could see a situation where they say, we agree that this comes into, that USMCA is in force, we're continuing to develop the uniform regulations, and we'll have informed compliance for six months or so, and it'll come into effect on January 1. In fact, I think that's probably where we're headed, is some kind of wink, wink, smile, smile, USMCA's here, get ready, we can claim this, this is good for the economy to say it's here, it's a political win, but there will actually have to be some legal things done to make that happen, because the text requires the uniform regs to be done by then. So I think the jury's still out, but you know, and there's going to be, as was noted in the question, there's a lot of pushback from the Hill already on June 1st. There's going to be a lot of pushback from industry once industry auto industry's already been there, the chambers are there. But I think as people kind of focus on this and say, how can we get there? I've kind of always expected that we will have a period of informed compliance. That's kind of been customs approach outside of the tariff situation, is when we've deployed things like e-manifest and others, there's always been a period of, or Food Safety Modernization Act and others, that there's a ramp-up period. I could actually see that. I think that's highly likely here, because customs isn't going to be ready. I know for a fact US CBP is not going to be ready by June 1st, unless there's a miracle. But I think we're saving those miracles for other things right now.
Got it. I may come back to Mara here in a second, but I wanted to answer another question by Mark Lowson out of Charlotte. Are there specific impacts to free trade zone operations in USMCA?
Well, I think FTZs will largely see operations the same. There are some specialty areas that I'm happy to talk to the questioner about. It gets way into the weeds for, I think, a general audience here. But I actually think FTZs are going to be a critical part of our growth. There's actually, I think, a movement afoot to have kind of North American FTZs. You could see that potential in the agreement. That's one of those mid-range where I think that's a great benefit to border communities in the Great Lakes region and U.S. Southwest. So, yeah, I do think there are benefits to FTZs. I think there are a lot of benefits to using FTZs, both at the present time and beyond, but happy to get into the reads with the questioner as well. But on a general level, yes. FTZs should be in good shape.
Okay, great. The next question is by Luke Wentz of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. He asks, Dan, thanks for your willingness to join us. My question is about the importance of America's leadership in the context of international development, and how important this is to creating the conditions for economic prosperity later. For example, Mexico was at one time a recipient of U.S. foreign aid. For example, in the Triangle, why is America's international development footprint important to the sustainability of our economic ecosystem?
Well, that's a great question, and that touches more on policy and inherently embedded in that is politics. And you know, I agree with the overall sentiment that U.S. leadership is important. We have a responsibility. I think the response, and I can't speak for the U.S. administration. Obviously, I'm here to tell my clients not how it should be, but the way that the world is, and so we can plan. But I think the response that you would hear is that one of the ways that the U.S. is promoting aid is rather than just direct financial assistance. You know, my mentor was actually the general counsel for USAID before it started for the Marshall Plan after World War II. So this is something near and dear to my heart. But I think one of the things that we would hear from the administration, I think, is that part of this trade agreement will actually provide that aid through strong labor rules, through enforcing Mexico's domestic labor reforms, by rebalancing trade and supporting a middle class. And so, I mean, I just think the mantra for today is that, or the mantra of this administration is we are rebalancing trade. And in order to do that, we had the era of free trade. Many of you know my views on that. I think the era of free trade is over. Now we're in the march to manage trade. And the question is, how long are we going to be marching in managed trade? I think, is there something in between? We hear a lot about fair and reciprocal trade and those kind of things. But I agree with the overall sentiment of the questioner that international trade and aid is important. But I think what you're also going to hear in leadership is that you're also going to hear is that the U.S. is leading. And by creating that, some of the issues that we've had have been with us a while because we didn't do the types of things we're doing now. And I think the jury's out on that, in my opinion.
As an advisor myself to the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, go to usgl.org. I'd like to know more, but their basic premise is that by having foreign aid to countries, you're able to build commerce and you'll be able to avoid military action. So their coalition between business, government, the military is unique and amazing, I think. I encourage everybody to learn more about that, and I think you'll gain a lot from it. We probably have time for one or two more questions. This one is also from Mara, Dan. It's not on the USMCA implementation, but do you have any insight to how the lockdown of Canadian border affects goods shipment across the land border between the US and Canada? Will drivers have to switch on the bridges? So this is a very Detroit question, probably, or maybe even Ohio.
Yeah, I mean, that's my past life. I worked in the U.S. government and Canadian government on border issues. I think we do have measures in place. One of the, I think right now, my understanding is that they do not have to switch in that. But keep in mind, one of the programs that we put, one of the significant areas of focus after 9/11, 2001, was the development of trusted trader programs like FAST, Free and Secure Trade, and CTPAT, the Customs and Trade Partnership Against Terrorism and Partners in Protection in Canada, PIP. What part of those, the benefits of those programs were designed for this very situation was that if we ever, one was on day-to-day that you would get some facilitation, that you would be kind of at the front of the line and have your own lanes. We still need some work there. But it's for this very situation that I do think, I think at the moment, there is not a switch out of drivers. I haven't followed the news in the last couple hours since we've been on the line. But I think what we will do, but what is certainly is I think CTPAT and FAST drivers will be permitted to continue to and PIP will be committed to roll through. That was the standing protocol that was in place for the border, and I think that would likely hang tight now because that included pandemics. So I think those entrusted trader programs are in Canada, U.S. are really going to see the benefits of those programs, I think, within the coming weeks and months.
Dan Ujczo, thank you so much for sharing. Obviously, an expert in so many things, including, there's a switch drivers on bridges between the U.S. and Canada. Your life experiences, the work that you're doing now are incredibly valuable to our membership. And so thank you for really an outstanding presentation today. And those of you out there who are interested in reaching Dan, you can go to the Wright website. You can send an email to info@globalchamber.org. You can go to the directory of Global Chamber and find Dan. There's lots of ways to reach him. But the points he's making about getting your business ready, we can't emphasize that enough. This is not a repapering of the wall. It's the renovation, as he talked about. And so get your business ready this year for what's happening. Dan, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks to all. Thank you very much.
One last 30 seconds here. I do want to mention that to stay engaged, all of you. Pandemic is a challenge, but it's one that we will beat. And so be engaged, be involved. We have, if you're a live watcher of this, later in this day, in a few hours, we have the Grow Globally Fair of Tucson. So if you've ever wanted to learn about the U.S.-Mexico border and what's going on there, you can tune in, and not available to you before. So that's actually an advantage. So we have 4 experts talking about what's going on at the border and opportunities. So check that out, the Grow Globally Fair of Tucson. And remember that we have, I think, about 10 virtual opportunities in the next 5 days through Global Chamber. So we want you to stay involved. We've got all sorts of programming to keep you involved. And of course, the main thing that we do is create warm introductions between you and business opportunities. So take advantage of those as well. We're head down looking to help you grow and to your way through this crisis. Thanks again to Dan, and thank you all for participating today. Have a great rest of your week.